Welcome to everyone who has joined us. We are thrilled to have you here this afternoon for a conversation on understanding world poetry with Sascha Ebeling. We are really grateful, Sascha, to have you here for our Conversations at Graham series. For those of you who I don't know, I am Seth Green, the Dean of the Graham School, and I want to welcome you to our gorgeous university on what is a beautiful day that is showing signs of spring here, which is one of my favorite seasons at the university because we are a botanic garden university, and in spring, you really feel it blooming. I also want to mention that if you want to feel the fullness of spring, don't forget to register for your spring courses so that you can learn alongside the beautiful sprouting of flowers and trees. I will also mention that we have many gatherings coming up in the next few weeks. Next week, we have a conversation on the power of connection with Alison Gilbert and Cassie Killam, two best-selling authors on the subject. Then we have a conversation on leading with practical wisdom with Atiya Singh, previewing her residential seminar on that topic. And then finally, in early April, we have a conversation on strategic leadership in dynamic times with the Wall Street Journal Leadership Institute president and CEO Alan Murray, who has a storied career as a leader at the Journal and a number of other publications, and now one of the leaders in leadership and how to think about it. But the reason you are all here is because you want to learn from my wonderful colleague at the university, Sascha Ebeling. Sascha, welcome. Sascha is an associate professor in South Asian languages and civilizations, comparative literature, and the college. He is a scholar of comparative literature and cultural history and studies both modern and pre-modern South Asian and Southeast Asian literary and cultural traditions, and some of the less commonly studied European literatures. He is someone who we have a wonderful history with. He has taught in our Master of Liberal Arts. He'll be teaching again on world poetry. And we are even in conversation with him about a number of travel study ideas. So, Sascha, it is wonderful to welcome you. And to get us started and lay the table, so to speak, for the rest of our conversation, can you talk about what drew you to building this course that's coming up this spring on understanding world poetry for our lifelong learners?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Seth, for having me. It's great to be here and to share some ideas about poetry. I mean, those of you who are joining us, thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope you'll get something, get to hear something that's of interest today. But don't forget, this is just the preview. There will be the actual class that will follow, where we'll have a little more time, to talk about poetry and all the questions you may have had in the past and always wanted to have answered. So, Seth, you asked me about, how did I get the idea? Um, uh, there are different reasons really for it. I mean, one is that, poetry is something that's close to my heart, so I end up teaching it quite a bit. I've read poetry ever since I can remember, really. Um, and when you teach poetry, you often run into people who tell you that they would like to know more about it, but they're a little bit afraid. And they say, I've never formally studied it. I think it's something that's much more complex and complicated than just picking up a novel or something. So reading poetry becomes this kind of mysterious project that we need specialized knowledge for. A lot of people haven't had a good introduction to poetry in school, so they don't have fond memories of how that went. And so it's among all the literary forms that we normally take up, poetry seems to be something that people are a little more hesitant. And so I thought, there must be a way of addressing that and finding ways into poetry where you can, start reading poetry without knowing anything about poetry or about language or about literature or cultural history. And so that's why I put together a course that would kind of focus on giving the tools to get something out of studying poetry without, having to study hundreds of hours and, becoming a specialist scholar.
Well, so we're going to dive in a little later to the course and talk about some of what you'll be reading. But I want to start with the bigger picture question of why you think poetry matters to our society. What does it offer? Why is it potentially a valuable medium in addition to all the other forms of communication?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. So Again, there are several possible answers. I think it's true that for most of us, poetry is a little bit different for everybody, depending on your own reading preferences, on your own experience of interacting with, works of art. Um, there are, as most people know, various definitions of poetry. So, one way to attack the question would be to say, well, what do you mean by poetry when you ask that question, right? And I think one very loose kind of, or, one definition that fits a lot of possible cases of poetry is that it's a work of art or it's a text where the author has put some thought into both the content and the form. So it's usually something where, a lot of us end up writing emails or something, that where we don't pay a lot of attention to the form. You say, okay, it's not a poem because it's not in verse or it's not, it's just the prose text and I'm writing it because I just want to communicate some ideas. Poetry has an additional component, which is that people care about the way in which the content is presented, right? So that can mean something like having uh, the same number of syllables per line or having sound structures that repeat and rhymes and kind of bells and whistles basically to the message. But I think apart from the formal characteristics, it's also true that when you look at the history of poetry, I mean, people have been writing poetry for thousands of years. And in a lot of literary traditions, it's poetry that is the first, the first texts that we know are poetry, right? And not prose or short stories or, novels. I mean, those are all very modern genres, and there's a reason for that. So that's something we'll go into a little bit when we look at the class. Um, but if you look at the global history of poetry, it's very clear that people have used that medium to record things, thoughts, themes, issues that were very important to them. And to make sure that, subsequent generation would also be interested and take this up, they recorded them in a specifically nice form. I mean, or interesting or intriguing or, sometimes repetitive form. So, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes great sense. And something that you mentioned in the preparatory conversation, which I thought was fascinating, is to think about the special value that poetry might have in times of change or disruption. And to come to what you've just talked about in terms of, this like early introduction to it in our lives, I think of raising my kids and how much poetry I read to them during that stage. But can you talk a little bit about this idea of the value poetry might have to all of us in times of disruption or change?
Yeah, I think, that's one of the features of poetry is that people have been drawn to it in times when you're looking for answers that you can't easily find, right? So you often go back to something that somebody has written maybe a very long time ago to kind of find some kind of community with people from remote places and remote times. And what's intriguing is that we actually find much more often than we would expect. I mean, in principle, it's a little miracle to think that somebody, who lived 5,000 years ago actually would have something to say that we can understand today. And, we'll talk about the details of what it takes to be able to understand messages from so long ago in the course. So there are some tools we need to be able to do that in a meaningful way. But in principle, we know that it's possible. And that, is something that's very interesting and shows us kind of a common humanity, if you want. Sometimes, poetry, everybody's taste is different, but for a lot of people, experiencing poetry means that they experience um, beauty in some
Yeah.
form, and so poetry is a wonderful way of allowing beauty into our lives in a time when we're maybe otherwise occupied with, you know, difficult thoughts. Um, the other thing, I mean, so for a more utilitarian answer, if you're more interested in the payoff and say, I'm paying money for a poetry class, so what do I get in return? Well, one thing is that it's a very practical matter. It's the deep focus on reading, and the kind of reading that we do when we read poetry, where we look at every word, sometimes every syllable, every sound of what's out there. Doing something like that automatically enhances our own way with words, right? Because there's just no way that if you spend so much time, turning over every syllable, looking at sentence structures, looking at sounds, looking at different ways of presenting your thought, there's no way that your own thinking will not be affected by this, right? So next
Yeah.
time you have to write something, you will say, well, here I wrote something where coincidentally it rhymes, and that's bad. I don't want that, so I don't sound funny in the thing I'm saying. So, you kind of the focus on language and on words and on how we can put different forms of thought, different ideas into words is something that, very practically leads to some practice with your own language. The other thing is we read poems from different languages. So you also will get, if you want it or not, you'll get a crash course of those kind of languages, and you learn a little bit about how they work. I mean, obviously, the course is about a day long. We'll have a whole Saturday to actually read some world poetry, so you won't be able to speak fluently all the languages in which we'll read poetry. But you will, at the end of that course, have a good understanding of how a bunch of these languages work structurally. So,
Yeah.
in other words, what it would take to learn those languages more fully, what approaches you can take, how they work, how sentences work in those languages.
Well, so Sasha, can we explore an example and glimpse into this class and maybe hear from you about how you would apply numerous lenses? Because one of the things we talked about in the preparatory conversation is that you're going to look at poems and you'll apply a historical lens, a formal lens, a
Mhm.
thematic lens. And those are ways that people can, well beyond this course, use the tool of reading with these lenses toward anything they read, especially poetry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, poetry or the study of poetry is also a way of reading, right? It's something that we do to a text. It's a kind of, you could say, particular lens. I think that optical metaphor works quite well. So, we have different perspectives that we can take vis-a-vis a text, and you can take those different perspectives to other texts. So that's why, in the study of poetry, I often have people who have studied law, because in law, you also need to pay particular attention to language and to how precisely something is worded. And, small nuances, small changes can make a huge difference, right? And that's something that poetry has in common. And, studying poetry kind of primes you for those kind of things. Yeah, so let's look at a kind of more or less randomly chosen example. Marina, if you would share the screen.
There we go. I see it on my end now.
Okay, yep, I see it on mine too. So, we could start a little bit with the question of presentation. So, in most cases, poems come to us with titles. So there is the poem, and then there is something that is a text outside of the poem itself, but something that's very connected to it, the title that points us in a specific direction. And with this particular poem, some of you might already know it. It's a very well-known poem by an English poet. Um, with this particular poem, it makes a big difference if we start reading with the title of the poem, because 1914, The Soldier, and then, as you will see, there will be England a lot in that poem, kind of moves us directly into thinking about what? About World War One, right? So maybe this is a poem, 1914, about World War One, which in fact it is. And knowing that, having that information makes a bit of a difference in how we will read the poem. But let's see what happens when we read the poem. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think, this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind, no less gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learned of friends, and gentleness, in hearts at peace, under an English heaven. So one of the things that, immediately strikes you with this poem is that it says England, England, English a lot. And from the very first lines, if we kind of look at the message and what, the poet is saying here, it's obviously that the speaker in the poem is very concerned with the place of England, with being English, with, Englishness. So what does he say? He says, if I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. So that, together with the information about the First World War, immediately gets us into, a battlefield scene, maybe where a soldier is thinking about what will happen when, they die in battle. If you look at the first line, if I should die, think only this of me. One thing that's remarkable is that it's completely unremarkable. It sounds like a normal sentence, right? If I should die, think only this of me. Maybe today in our language, the if I should die is a little bit uncommon, and maybe also in American English, you would rather say if I die. But in principle, it's not, it uses very common words. It's a very simple sentence, a very simple message. If I should die, think only this of me, right? Don't do anything else. Don't think sad thoughts, think all these things. So one of the things that you also realize when you read the poem is that it's very regularly structured. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England, there shall be. If you count the syllables per line, you'll realize that there are 10 syllables per line. And that is something that is a particular meter. So, we use um, a Greek word. The word for measurement it's a particular meter. It's the most commonly used meter for those of you who have studied, poetry before. The most commonly used meter of the English language. Um, and the reason it's so commonly used is that it is very much like people talking. So the sentence, if I should die, think only this of me, flows so casually and normally off our tongues because it is like a normal sentence. The meter is called iambic pentameter. If you want to know what that means, well, you have to take the class. We'll get to those kind of particular tools. But you can read this poem and make sense of it, and you'll see that a lot of it just reads like a perfectly normal message. But when you look a little bit closer, you see, oh, there is a regulated number of syllables per line. Not only that, there are rhymes at the end. There are 14 lines. All of those indicators taken together signal that this is a particularly well-known form of poetry, namely the sonnet. Now, the sonnet was first invented in Italy several hundred years, about what, 700 years before this particular poem was written. So then the question presents itself, why would somebody the poem was written in 1914 as well. It's not just called that. Why would somebody in 1914 ask that use that form that is so old and has been used for hundreds of years? What do you gain when you put your thoughts about dying as a soldier into that very well-known and popular form of the sonnet? And then you could say, well, to answer that question, we'd have to compare it with some other sonnets. And if we do that, we see that some of the features here are very typical for other people's sonnets. Some are not so much. So one of the things that happen here is that we have these run-on lines. So the sentences just kind of go on across the line break, which is something that in older sonnets people were trying to avoid. This is a more modern version of writing a sonnet. But anyway, so these are kind of different approaches to the text to kind of see what, how would we approach it? How would we get to it? Where are we coming from? We'll read it, we listen to it. I mean, it's always important to read poetry out loud because it's always meant to be heard rather than silently read. And, if you just read it in your mind, you often don't get the extraordinary sound effects, which we have in the poem here as well. So, I'll cut this off here because there's so many different aspects we can talk about. We could talk about then, the next level of information is the question about the author. Does it make a difference if we know who wrote this poem? Well, in a certain way, it does, because Rupert Brooke was is connected specifically to the First World War, in the sense that, he was a soldier fighting in it. Um, People have said about him that he was a much better poet than a soldier. That's one of the anecdotes you'll hear around his poetry, and you'll see when you read his poems. But knowing that will also help to kind of make sense of what he's saying here, and it will be an explanation for why he's so interested in his death being a symbolic act for England, right? Um, yeah, we'll leave it there because we don't have all day, but there's
That
more
is a
that.
fascinating poem. I mean, I'm particularly struck by seeing 1914 and then the end of his life, 1915.
Yes.
So he should die, I take it from that, and this is what he wants. So what a powerful poem as an example. Sasha, this is by what sounds like an English person. It is in English, admittedly British English, and there's the famous Churchill quote that we're united and divided by one language.
Right.
But in your course on world poetry, you are going to look a lot at poetry written in other languages, and you're going to be looking at the native language and then the translation. And I think that's a fascinating idea in a matter where, as you've said, this is not just about the substance, it's also about the form.
Mhm.
And so when you're reading poetry that is in another language and then it's translated, it's a big meaning to have translation because form is so important. And so I'm curious if you could just walk us through an example where you're going to be looking at world poetry and you're going to be in a translation where you're going to look at the original and then you'll look at the translation. And obviously, people won't necessarily speak the native language.
Right.
And so, how will you approach teaching that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's an important component of the course. So one of the things that I do is I want to give my students the tools that they need to understand poetry in other languages, even those that, we don't speak, which is common enough. I mean, you can never read world poetry if you want to learn all the languages first. You'll be dead by the time uh, you know, you will have arrived there. And so we have to find some kind of way into if we want to study poetry from other languages, into reading with and around and through translation. And some of it is really much easier than you think. I mean, studying any language and getting really, really good at it is extremely hard. So that can be the job of a lifetime or more. But having enough knowledge about a language and the structure and how it works to be able to make sense of a translation, for instance, and then compare the translation with the original, getting that kind of knowledge is not quite as difficult at all, really. And so we'll try this out in the class and see how far we can get. I have a slide for that as well. So maybe Marina can share that. So here is, to use something completely different as an example, here is an example of a um, poem from classical antiquity from South India. The language is called Tamil. It's a very famous poem in that language. And, we can't date it with great certainty, but we think that this poem, and there is a corpus of about 3,000 of them actually that are similar and were written by a bunch of poets active at that time, that these poems were written around the time of the beginning of the Christian era, so maybe a little bit before or a little bit after. Um, and here it is. I'm just going to read it to you, and then I'll walk you through the translation part. Kongu terwarke Anjirai tumbi kamam sepade kandade murimu. Pailiadu keria natpin mailial serieri charive kundalin nariavumulavo ni arium puve. So here, you'll first see the poem. I sometimes include the originals in the original script, just in case, we sometimes have people who actually know the languages. And then, for all the languages that don't use the English alphabet, we have what we call a transliteration. So we actually render the words of the original into uh, words that we can pronounce with a few rules. Here we have what we call diacritical signs. So we have, added little, there's a kind of hyphen above the first E, for instance, conguter, which indicates that it's long. You have dots on and kind of hyphens underneath the word. So, we can talk about that at length in the class. So that's basically to render sounds that we don't have in English, to actually mark them and say, this is that sound that you want here. Then what I do is I give a word by word translation for each line. This is why it's helpful to have a short poem like this one, so you can spend a lot of time thinking about how the lines work together and how you get sentences. So if you look at the very first line, if we just translate every word into English, the first three words are pollen, surge, life. And then is a word for beauty, serai means wing, and tumbi is a word for bee. So the first line says, pollen search life, beauty wing bee. And it says only that. It doesn't say there are no relationships between those words indicated. It's just a simple string of different kinds of words. Almost all of them are nouns, except for the second word. The search is a verb form. So in order to communicate that in a translation, you would have to put in a lot of additional material. This is why, one of the problems we get in translation or in translating this into English is that the poem just becomes much, much longer and bigger and wider because we need more words to actually indicate the relationship between these words. In the original, we only have pollen search life, beauty wing bee. But what we think this means is what I've given you in the translation. It's first of all, the bee is being addressed by the speaker. There's somebody who talks to the bee. That's why we have the OB, which sounds a little bit antiquated. So if you don't like the old, that's something, very 19th century sounding OB for what we call a vocative, or, the addressing somebody. You could also say hi bee or hey bee or something. It's addressing the bee, right? Or bee with pretty wings whose life is a search for pollen or is searching for pollen. That's what the first sentence means if we put it together. And then we can do kind of a similar, I'm going to cut this short here as well, but we'll do a similar analysis of the rest of the lines, and it will say, tell me what you saw, not what I wish to hear. Among the flowers that you know, are there any as fragrant as the tresses or the long hair, you could say, of my wife, my woman, who has perfect teeth and is beautiful as the peacock, and who is bound to me by enduring love? And once we kind of look at some more of the formal characteristics, and we could talk a little bit about meter. There's no obvious rhyme in this poem, but it is metrical. And it was probably sung, although we don't know anymore what those forms of recitation were. They just have not been recovered. Um, and then, we'll talk a little bit about the context for this poem, under what circumstances it would have been spoken and how it makes sense and how we can make sense of it today. So those are kind of, the ways of approaching something in a language that you might not know. So.
Well, that is a fascinating example, Sascha. And I'm going to come now to our chat. And let me just invite everyone who has questions to please chat them in, or feel free to use the reactions function at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, and we can unmute you and have you ask your question directly to Sascha. I'm going to start with Greg Gosik's question about poetry, by definition, focusing on oral effects. Or does it retain legitimacy, he writes, by leveraging other senses such as the visual? It seems that especially in a social media age, linking poetic text with animation to directly convey imagery would be an effective way to increase the accessibility of verse. Song lyrics, he mentions, are pop culture's poetic analog. I'll acknowledge being a huge Swiftie and seeing some of her writing as poetic in nature.
Sure.
So just talk about how to think about poetry, how to think about its ubiquity. Does it apply across these different levels? And what does it mean to be a poet in an age of social media?
Yeah. Um, There are many, many questions in this one question, so we could take a long time to
Mhm.
unpack them, but I'll try my best. Um, One way to look at this is to say that poetry has always been visual. I mean, from the time that people have started writing it down. We tend to think about most poetic traditions that they are rooted in some kind of oral/oral culture, so that, poetry is older than writing. I think that's probably right. The evidence for that exists in certain literary traditions, not so much in others. But in principle, I think that as a rule of thumb, we can say that poetry is often older than writing systems. And, people have had the hypothesis that we have metrical regulation and rhyme and things like that to actually aid people in remembering
Yeah.
poetry, right? And that it came about precisely, so I mean, people basically, if you don't write things down and you want to remember the verse, it helps that you have repetitions and you know how many syllables your line is supposed to have. You can't put random words in. Um, but from at some point in every tradition, you will have a point when people write things down and when it becomes important to actually keep poetry exactly the way that it was conceived of by the poet, right? Because one thing that can go terribly wrong when you don't write things down is that people will substitute words, and the whole kind of oral performance is precisely that especially if it's longer than just four lines maybe everybody can remember, but if you have to remember a few thousand lines, you might miss things here and there. So then what do you do if it's very important that you don't miss things, right? That is the case, for instance, in religious text, because if it's the word of God, it's important not to change it around. It might actually have an effect in the meaning and in the religious act that it represents. But for a long time now, if we look, backwards from our time today, poetry has been visual, and has been used across various media. I mean, first of all, there is visual poetry, so people have also tried to, come up with different layouts. I mean, we'll actually see examples. That's something that is, people experimented with a lot in from the 1920s onwards in many European languages, where you would make little shapes out of the syllables of a poem, but it has precedents that go far back. I mean, there are all kinds of other visual poems from earlier traditions. So, I mean, the visual has always been linked to it. Um, Songs have always been connected to poetry very intimately. A lot of poetry was meant to be sung or was sung. In some cases, we already we still know how it was sung and performed. In some cases, like in the Tamil poem, we don't know anymore what it would have sounded like in recitation. And song lyrics also, they have rhyme. I mean, they're often, completely, they're poetry, absolutely. I mean, there's no question. And, that together with videos, I think, people have made video poems as well, where you can find visuals that underline certain themes that come up in a poem. There are certainly, there's a whole genre of YouTube videos that do that, right? That illustrate videos. So yeah, there's ample room for that connection, absolutely. So it's not just something that happens through our ear.
Great. We have another question here that I'm curious to get your thoughts on. It's are similarities in origin across cultures? Are there similarities?
Do you mean in origin, as in how poetry?
How poetry comes in, I'm guessing. They don't say, but that's how I read it.
Yeah, I mean, so one is the thing that I think I already mentioned, which is that for a lot of literary traditions, they tend to start with poetry. So, in some of the oldest literary texts that we have, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, is a poem, right? And we still read it today, and people have sort of passed it down through the times to other people because they're interested in the content, but they're also interested in the formal characteristics and the poetic form. So, I mean, one big common denominator is that across various cultures, people tended to record thoughts that were very important to them and that they wanted to be passed down to future generations, that they recorded those forms those thoughts in poetic form. right? And they came up with different meters, with rhymes, with different sound figurations. Um, but yes, it's very common that we have this beginning. It's also very common that we n don't know a lot about the societies around those poems. So we often have the case that we know of some very ancient texts, like in the case of Tamil, for instance. It's a very striking example. We have this corpus of poetry, but we don't know much about the society that produced it. So we can go by what this poetry tells us, but it's very specialized because it's divided into poems about love and poems about worldly pursuits or war. And beyond that, there's a whole bunch of things that, all many aspects of daily life were never covered in this poetry. And so we depend on the poetry to reconstruct that society to a certain extent. We have some archaeological evidence, but not a lot. And that makes it a bit more difficult to go back to those moments of origin to say what really happened. Yeah.
So we have a question that was privately chatted in here around how poetry is changing as the world, so to speak, and our communications are changing. Do you want to talk at all about the evolution that you're seeing? I mean, we're living obviously in a world of abundant information and constant communication that is very different in many ways than, the moment in 1914 when this soldier, poem is written. It's different than the sonnets that were originally starting 700 years prior in Italy. How do you see this form evolving as we look to the future and think about the massive change in the way that we communicate with one another that's taking place right now?
So there are different ways to answer that question. I think if you go back in time to look at historical change,
Yeah,
one aspect of poetry that we often don't think about anymore today, but that's very important if we go back all the way to, the course on poetry that I teach starts in about 1500 BC, right? So, and we start with texts from ancient India, basically, with hymns that were prayers of a certain form, right? And so this quality of text to actually bring things about when you utter a certain word, um, that quality of the text is something that isn't so much there anymore in contemporary poetry. Whereas in reading those old hymns, those ancient texts, we need to pay attention to that quality as well, that, saying a specific word in a specific context actually produces direct change in life. We have these moments still in our lives today in certain ritualized moments. So when you say, "With this ring I thee wed," you
right.
brought about something that didn't exist before. Or when you take an oath, for instance, your words produce a new situation that wasn't there before, right? So those are remnants from from times when those situations were much more common. And so language itself had this side to it that it could be dangerous. That's the world of curses, for instance, right? Curses were so powerful in antiquity because if you got them right, you would really do harm. I mean, that's the right. The idea was that it would
Yeah.
really bring about that situation that you're talking about. And that is a component that over time just sort of isn't prominent anymore. And it's not for, I venture to say, for most of us reading today, even across different cultures, it's not how we approach text today, right? So moving into the future, I think people have always been fascinated by how we use words. I mean, using language is such a fundamental human thing that we do, and we've been able to create so much out of language. We've created entire parallel universes, right? The whole worlds of fiction, of novels, of Harry Potter, and things that don't exist in the world. I'm sorry to, unveil the fact that it may not be real, right? I mean, so words can do all those things. So I think that fascination won't ever go away. And that also means that people will automatically pay attention to um, the sound of words. and how they sound when they hang together, right? A lot of us have an ear for these things that, you hear somebody says a sentence and it sounds to you like it could be a line in a song, right? Because it actually metrically fits perfectly in that pattern that you know so well. And so our brains are kind of wired for poetry in a certain way. And so I think we'll always be producing it, whether you send it around via email to your friends or whether you just, post it online or something. I mean, they're kind of interesting media changes. But poetry will always, people will always be interested in using words for more than just sending a message, right?
We have an interesting question here from Jeff Sheffield on translations, and he names that there are multiple translations of famous world poems like the Iliad.
Yeah.
How should someone who doesn't read the language judge or approach these different translations? How do you think that he can be, a thoughtful critic as he reads multiple translations and thinks about which one is the right fit for him?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question because that's something that goes very much to the project of this class. So we'll talk about this and learn techniques for attacking precisely this question. I mean, one thing to say that is very important is that for a lot of great poetry from, traditions around the world, there are many different translations. So the first step is simply to look at all of them and see, or, as many as you can find. I mean, if you try this for Dante's Inferno, there's a new English version every 6 months. So, so you will find much more than you can ever digest. But for a lot of poetry, you'll find translations written at different times. And so you will see that a lot of what goes into the translation is actually a sign of that time rather than, a sign of the original. Or at least you can ask yourself that question and say, well, here I have, think about the King James Bible versus, a modern version that we might use more commonly, for instance, how different they sound. And yet they're, saying we're translations of the same original, right? There you immediately see that there's a lot of leeway between what a translation can be. But in general, I mean, especially if you don't know the original language, it's helpful to look at as many translations as you can find. And then it's a process of triangulation or whatever you want to call it, where you say, well, this translation brings out this aspect, this other translation brings out that aspect. And, for a lot of us, that's the moment when you're actually peaked to study the original language and to say, wait, wait, wait. To me, this can't possibly all be translations of the same original. They are so different. So let's look at the original. And, studying the original languages has never been as easy as it is today. I mean, the YouTube videos you can watch for a lot of very famous poems, you will find people giving explanations in English on the internet who just do it because it's a fun activity to do. So we're in a better position than ever before with having access to the whole world through the internet, of making up our mind a little bit, studying something about an author, for instance. I mean, we have English language Wikipedia pages on poets from across various linguistic traditions, right? So you can look up more information about that, and people just keep posting more and more information. So we're in a good position to do that kind of work and comparison.
I know we are at time. We have a final question I want to get to from Ken Murray, which is his own reading of a book by Stanley Burnshaw that you might be familiar with about foreign language poems called The Poem Itself. And
Yeah.
he quotes Robert Frost: "You don't translate the poems, you discuss them in English." This seems to be what you are saying, Ken writes, about how you can appreciate the poem beyond just reading the translation. Is that correct? And maybe we can let you add any final remarks on how to think about this question of translation.
Yeah. So translation is one of the deepest ways of reading any text, right? Because you always have to, as a translator, you always have to ask yourself, what am I looking at here? What is the important part in the poem that I need to translate? I mean, poetry always puts us in this impossible, any translation really. I mean, it's the same problem with prose. you're always in this position where you can't translate every possible aspect of the original work. That's almost like a Borges question, where if you had a translation of the original, it would be the original, right? The original cannot exist in any other version, and certainly not if languages are so different, the way that our languages are, right? In English, we have a short word and longer words. That alone makes it very difficult. So you can say, well, the number of syllables, if 10 syllables per line is an important feature, like we saw in the soldier poem, getting that in the original may be very difficult. So saying, and even translating it into a language that is very close technically to the language that it's coming from. So let's say we translate the soldier poem into German. German has a lot of poems with 10 syllable lines, right? So this is and German has a great tradition of producing sonnets. So translating this sonnet into a German sonnet is entirely possible. But what you do then is you can't keep the sequence of the original words, for instance. So that is an aspect that you have to sacrifice. You often run up against problems with your rhymes that, so that was one of the reasons why the sonnet form was actually transformed from when it was adopted in English vis-a-vis the Italian original, because Italian rhymes work differently from rhymes in English. So there are always aspects of translation that you can't produce. So you have to decide for yourself on a certain kind of compromise. And that act itself makes translation um, something, just a very, very careful act of reading. So mostly you can read a poem very casually and just kind of fly over it. But once you're asked to translate it, you immediately engage with it at a very deep level. And you have to constantly ask yourself, well, is this an important feature? I notice here is a rhyme, here is an alliteration, here are, it's a regulated number of syllables per line, for instance. And then you have to ask yourself, what of that is important and how important is it to me in this particular translation? So, and in a certain way, with all uh, poetry reading, I mean, you've seen this just now in reading the soldier poem, for instance. What we do is a translation, right? We circumscribe it, we paraphrase it, we just express the same thing in different words and give different emphases to it and see where. So yeah, I mean, we discuss it into English. I think that's a very good way of putting this. Absolutely.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Sasha. It has certainly whetted my appetite for the day-long course that you're going to be starting with, and also our excitement for the possibility of even deeper engagement, because I think that what you're really endeavoring here is at the core of the lifelong liberal arts that we have as our core at the Graham School. So thank you for what has been an immensely enlightening and energizing conversation. Thank you for teaching at Graham, and very excited about your full version of this engagement next month. And thank you all for joining us and peeking into the power of poetry with us. I hope everyone has a great afternoon.